Well, anyways, let's get started. It's the interesting thing, about talking about whether the Bible is something we can really trust. It's a lot about understandings and misunderstandings. I always like this particular cartoon. It says you have Jesus in the boat, and the guy says, "You idiot!" He said, "Cast the nets." Okay, thank you. One person. It's all in the translation, I guess. So it's I want to talk about history. And really, that's a significant aspect of what we're talking about here today, because it's understanding, is what we have in terms of the Bible, is it something that we can really trust in, and has it come down to us these last over these last 2,000 years in a way that we can have any kind of confidence that what we are using now is similar to what they had then. I say the word similar because the Bible is written basically in two different languages. The Old Testament is mostly Hebrew. There's some Aramaic in it, but the New Testament is written in Greek. So since none of you speak Hebrew or Greek, or maybe one of you, well, it depends. Someone said, "Oh, I speak Greek." Okay, wonderful. You just ruined my point. But anyways, the fact is matters that they're languages that, in fact, they're languages, even though that they have existed, are different now than they were back then. Although Greek is actually interestingly very similar. But anyways, there's a reason why we won World War II, by the way. Sister beats paper. Okay, okay, at least someone laughed on that. Some of you are still playing. What is it? It's called scissors, paper.
Here we go.
Rock is the other one, yeah. So, but anyways, when we're talking about, what we're talking about is documents, really, and historical documents, in terms of can we trust this, because there's science behind this, and so we want to recognize certain things about it, and a lot of times when we're looking at ancient documents, we're not looking at the full thing. We're actually looking, the closer we are usually getting to when it was originally written, the more incomplete it tends to be. Because we're putting together bits and pieces and so forth. So we have to understand that that's something that's going on. And, and a lot of times and we also have to recognize that the documents that we're using the ones that we're using were not written at the time that it happened. This is true right across the board. This is not just something that we're dealing with Old and New Testaments. We are all dealing with copies. None of us, I don't care what document we're talking about in history, we're not dealing with originals, and that's true of the Bible as well. We don't have any of the originals, okay? But that's true no matter what ancient document we're looking at. When we're talking about the Odyssey and the Iliad, when we're talking about the plays of Sophocles, when we're talking about the Annals of the Gallic Wars by Julius Caesar, we don't have any of the originals. Okay? So we're all in the same boat on that. And sometimes we have to recognize that just like today, when people write things down, they have their own biases, right? A lot of times, what they say, history is written by those who won, right? And that is a factor. That is a factor. And so we need, when we're looking at examining documents, we need to recognize that that's something that's happening, okay? And as a reader, we must also recognize our own preconceptions. It's not like we're objective. We all have the way that we look at things. We have, in today's world, our own 21st century worldview that we often take into a document and read our worldview into their worldview, which was vastly different. And we need to understand that that's happening. Okay? And if you're an historian, you need to recognize that often when we're historians and we're putting things together, this is true, by the way, in all sciences, is that we have our own theories and expectations. And we tend to look for the evidence that supports us, not for the evidence that doesn't. Make sure you talk to your biology professor about their theories and expectations about what they're researching, because they have their own biases as well. Okay, so you got to keep these things in mind, because this is what it is to be a true academic, by the way. It's like when I'm talking to someone on campus that's atheistic, I often find, that they're really not, they're interested in debating. I always tell them, well, sure, we can debate, but I'm going to win. You might think I'm arrogant about that, but you know what I tell them? I say, I've read your stuff. So I know your stuff. Maybe you know your stuff a little bit better. But I really know my stuff. And you know what you do with my stuff? You take it out of context. And I said, and I can make a Richard Dawkins sound like a Christian. All I have to do is take him out of context. See, so I'm going to win. So, but the trouble with debates is that we tend to think that whoever shouts the loudest or gets the last word won. But everybody walks away with anybody changing their mind. It's useless. So I say, I'm going to win. But if you want to talk about it, if you want to have a discussion, let's do it. And that's what I'll go after. So, and then I find out, who's really into it. But I am going to poke fun at some historians, who enjoy hours of fun rewriting history just like the professionals. So you can do this too. Wait, you can do this too. No, I don't want you to do that. So, anyways, more important questions to ask. And that is, when we're looking at a document, how close in time is the document to the event in question? So obviously, the closer the gap, the more likely that we're going to have a reliable copy, right? Because things may tend to change through time. Okay, so now, by the way, though, we do know that ancient oral history, stuff that came down as they talked around campfires, ends up to be fairly reliable in ancient times because they don't have the technology. And in most ancient societies, you were responsible to get the story right. So when you're retelling the stories, the tendency is you'll get called out if you get it wrong. And so we have found actually in studies that oral history actually, in those kinds of things, comes down pretty accurately. And so, but we're talking now about documents, and so the thing is that we know that in ancient times, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking about the Bible or not, it was a big deal to get this right. The writing papyrus and whatever mechanism they're writing things down on was expensive. And so you don't waste this stuff. You don't waste skin that you're writing down, if it's a skin of some kind. You don't have a lot of this. You don't have a lot of availability, so you got to get it right. It's got to be perfect. So that's a big deal. There's no, sorry, I made a mistake, X. We have paper in abundance, so we just throw this out, go to another one. They didn't have that. Does the author have a reputation for truthfulness? And a lot of times, if you've got multiple writings, you can kind of pick out, what's consistent, what's inconsistent. Is the document internally consistent? In other words, are there contradictions within the document itself? Is it making sense? Again, I'm speaking historically here, the science of documents, historical documents, not just about the Bible. Was the author a direct participant in the event in question? And more likely that, there's an eyewitness. Again, you got to wonder about the bias, right? Because that would be academic. Was there a bias there? But an eyewitness is more likely to have something accurate. Okay? Does the document report events that are clearly impossible? You have to ask that about the Bible, right? I mean, walking on water? I've tried that. Did it work? No. I sank. I'm not good in water. I'm really sorry to bring this up because it's very painful to talk about, but anyways. Because my definition of swimming is staying alive in the water. That's very hard. Actually, my wife didn't believe me that my wife is just a floater. She's like, and you think with all this that I'd float? No, I still, I just did. It's like when I baptize people by myself that are 400 pounds. And they said, are you strong enough to keep you up? And I go, you'll float. But anyways, when they're 88 pounds, you can keep them about 3 or 4 rows over. That's just. Anyway, sorry. Anyways, but my flotation point, by the way, is about 4 feet, 5 feet below the surface. Really hard to breathe down there. So anyways, this document report events are clearly impossible. Is the document consistent with other documents? In other words, are things agreed? Are the events mentioned in the document referred to anywhere else? In other words, is there more attestation to what's going on in the situations? Does the document show evidence of systematic bias? In other words, again, it's the winner thing. It's like they only see through one lens. And it's interesting. Actually, we do have a couple books in the Bible that's actually pretty clear. That's called First and Second Chronicles, because it's redoing the history that we find in 1 Samuel to 2 Kings, but it's only doing it from Judah's perspective, the southern kingdom. And it's done on purpose. It's actually, in the Hebrew Bible, it's the last writings. It's the last writings. It's not, in our Bible now, we have it with history. And so it follows, but it actually has a very clear bias towards setting up for the Messiah. And which is really interesting, since that's what happened next. But we kind of have that out of order. But, and maybe bias would be a hard word, but it definitely has a theme of promoting the rightful king that is to come, who will be the Messiah. Really intriguing, actually. Is there some other reason to suspect deliberate distortion? And if we have only a copy of the original documents, is the copy an accurate reproduction of the original? And the thing is, we're all stuck on that, Now, I love this little cartoon, and if you're a vegan, I hope you have a sense of humor, okay? So but I actually showed this I was teaching this at a campus ambassador retreat, 10 years ago now. And I got people mad at me then. I have vegans in my family, by the way. They're really annoying. They're really I love them. I love them. They're wonderful, but boy, does it make Thanksgiving and Christmas confusing. And so, anyways, here's Moses going, I will lead you to the land of milk and honey. And it says, excuse me, what about those who don't consume animal products? And land of milk and honey isn't much of an incentive for us. And you do realize that bees often get their little legs torn off when you steal their honey. And don't get me started what happens to those poor goat udders. Oh boy. Poor goats. Anyways. But, a lot of times, what we bring in, again, I was saying this earlier, is that we bring in our own viewpoints to text, especially when we're talking about the Bible, and I'll talk about specifically here, is that we often take our own perspective and how we view things. And I have a son-in-law who's a vegan. He's also a pastor, and so it's very interesting because sometimes I've caught him taking his viewpoint about being a vegan into a text instead of letting the text speak out to him. And the thing is that our responsibility is always to hear what the text is saying in its own culture, in its own worldview, before we start applying our context onto it. And so always understand what the text is saying in its own culture first. And that'll actually get you really far in Scripture. Pastor Jerry, who's the pastor here, Pastor Jerry Gillis, does this really, really well. And he always takes a lot of time to study the Scripture and understand it in its original context first before he takes it to apply it to today. That's why I like it. I like it for other reasons too. But yeah, so anyway, some pertinent facts about the Bible. Actually, some of this I already said. But it is one book that's a collection of writings. Okay? And so there's a lot going on in Scripture, and it's the Old Testament, again, written in Hebrew. Interestingly, Hebrew is an Eastern worldview language, and so people from the Middle East and Asia often have a much easier time understanding Old Testament writings as opposed to those in Western worldview culture, which would be us. I remember one time I was doing one-on-ones with a gal from China, and we did the book of Job. When we finally got to the end of Job, she says, "This is the most wonderful book I've ever read." Kind of going, really? Wow. You know, it's like, you know, and she actually got it. She wasn't a believer yet, but she thought it was a wonderful book. And she would later come to know Christ. It was so good to see her on that journey. But Job is what she picked out to study with me. It was the most wonderful book. And it really is kind of a cool story. And things seem, you know, she actually saw the balance of it. The yin and the yang. She saw the balance of it. This is nuts. This is a crazy story. Right? What's going on? But she didn't have that reaction at all. But the book's a collection of writings, and so there's many authors involved. You know, we know the first 5 books are attributed to Moses. It wasn't like Moses was there at creation, so we know that's oral tradition that passed down. Again, we kind of know that oral tradition that really has a high degree of accuracy. So Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers are really all his fault because he wrote those. Deuteronomy he couldn't write because he died during it, so it makes it a little hard to write and die at the same time. And so, but it was a collection of messages that he gave to the people of Israel before they entered into the promised land. We really don't know who has written Joshua through 2 Kings, although we think that it was probably the same historian all the way through. That's that's collected the stuff and again oral tradition and brought it down. First and 2 Chronicles, we think actually Ezra did that, and Ezra, Nehemiah, and we don't know who did Esther. But anyways, Psalms, Job again. Job's a long epic poem. It's really crazy, cool. At the same time, I actually love going through Job. I've done it several times. And you gotta just read it out loud. You have to read it out loud to really understand it. You gotta read it with emotion, like you're in a play. Because when you do that, you know, these guys are trying to, smack Job around because he's definitely sinned, and he said, "I didn't do anything." It's about, if you read it out loud, it really comes alive. It's really fun. Psalms, obviously David. Most of them are David and others, and Solomon is responsible for the next bunch, and then all the prophets are responsible for their own things. And so, so it's a collection of writings, and one of the tests for the Bible really is, does it hang together? Is it consistent? And that's why the more you study it, actually, the more consistent you'll find it. Again, I can be like Richard Dawkins and pick things out of context and make it look like it doesn't agree. But again, it's if you're determined to take things out of context, then great, you can do anything you want. But the thing is, the more I study it, the more I find it agrees. And I just find it more and more fascinating. I have a great job, by the way, because I get to study the Bible all the time. It's like, it's really unfair to say, I don't have time for that, I know. Just do the best you can, okay? Well, one book divided in 2 major sections, again, Old and New Testaments. And I know I said this, Old Testament written in Hebrew, some Aramaic and Daniel, and there's some other just places where it's just a couple of words. New Testament was written in Greek, and in Greek was actually the very first Western world language, because that starts with the philosophers. You know, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, all about 400 years before Christ. And so this philosophical way of thinking of the world differently, instead of seeing everything as a whole and things in their place with the whole, the Greeks started taking things apart and started looking at the parts. There's a whole different way of looking at things. It's way different than the Eastern worldview. And that's what we inherited, because that's what we tend to do. We don't tend to see things in whole and balance. We tend to take everything apart and look at things consecutively. That's why we have such trouble trying to figure out what Genesis 1 is about. Because we have a Western worldview, so we think day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You know, these are consecutive. But for the Eastern worldview, that's not important at all. That's not what they think about. You're already getting frustrated, aren't you? I can just see it in your eyes. What does he say? You don't believe in creation? It's right there. Anyways, yeah, I'm not going there right now. That's another seminar. So, okay, true or false? This is for fun. Monkey rode on a donkey to Bethlehem.
Huh?
False.
I may say true. I may say false. We have no idea. Come on. You might have. It just doesn't say. Brother, you people. In Proverbs, it says, God helps those who help themselves. True.
That's the 11th commandment.
True. False. Okay, at least some of you are gutsy enough to raise your hand. It is false. Jonah was swallowed by a whale. True. False.
That was a big fish. Big fish.
Yeah, it doesn't say a whale. Although it's kind of hard to understand how a big fish, but Jesus was visited by 3 wise men at the stable. False. What's wrong with that?
You're not how many there were.
Oh, it doesn't say 3. And it was at a house, not a city, right? Okay. So, yeah. Knock it off. Yeah, that had 2 lies in it. Yeah, we actually don't know how many wise men came. And actually, when they walked into, we tend to, you know how when you ever do those creches, or we have the Sunday school program, we got these 3 guys dressed in robes, they're bringing, the 3 gifts. The 3 come with 3 gifts, and they all come in meek and mild, so forth. They didn't do that, by the way. They were Parthians, and they were sworn enemies of the Roman Empire, and they marched into Roman territory, into Jerusalem, and said, "Where's the King of the Jews?" Let me tell you, it was quite a ruckus. We just think there's these mild guys. They were kingmakers. That's what the Magi were known for. And so when they walk into Jerusalem, it's just like, who invited them? And what are they doing here? They don't belong here. What are they? Who are they to pronounce a king? We have a Caesar. Yeah, it's like, whoo! It must have, they would have come with a whole contingent. Camels, army, there was, we know that Herod was quite disturbed at this event, but it was for more than one reason. I mean, he was already disturbed, if you know what I mean. but this would disturb him even more. This is really quite interesting. But I can hardly wait to have him see the video replay. Really, I got so many things in the Bible, I can hardly wait to see what it looked like. I was like, I'm just gonna be sitting in the theater all day. Really depending on this when I get to heaven. So anyway. Actually, though, we're not made for heaven, we're made for new earth. But no, let's not get into that. That's another seminar. So, I got one more. The first sport mentioned in the Bible is baseball. True.
I feel like you're just crazy with this.
False. No, it's true. In the beginning. Okay. You guys are no fun, I'm just saying. Okay. I know I got you all worked up on that one. I pastored for 30 years, and they didn't get my humor either. So it was just, I'll tell it. I'd say something really funny, and they just go, crickets. I mean, it was just like, why are Christians so boring? I just don't get it. It's like I'd be speaking and it would be a great Sunday and things just really going great, and I'd look out and and I'd say, these people are not happy. I mean, I got joy, man. I got joy. But they're out there saying, I'm so happy in Jesus. Someone tell their face. It's just like, never mind. So, this is why, I enjoy college ministry so much more. Lord gave me a break. He said, you had enough. I think the Lord just said, you poor soul. Anyways, so how close in time is the document to the exact question? We have an original manuscript. I already told you that we don't. We don't have anything. So we just don't have those. But I think it's fair to say that it's most likely that closer in time, more likely we have something that's accurate in terms of what the document was. But let me give you an example, though, of the Gallic Wars by Julius Caesar. And I can do this with a lot of documents, by the way, because there's a vast difference in terms of how this happens. But the Gallic Wars by Julius Caesar was written about 50 BC, and he wrote them. We actually have other attestations that he wrote these from other writers at the time, talking about the fact that he wrote 7 volumes for the 7 years that the Gallic Wars took place. It's really very interesting. But the earliest copy we have, again, it's written in 50 BC, the earliest copy we have is AD 900. So we got a 950-year age gap. Okay, and so you see that's a big gap of time. And but the copies that we have of the New Testament stretch back into the 1st and 2nd centuries. So, and this is the only ancient writing that this happens with. It doesn't happen in the place of Sophocles. It does not happen with Plato. It does not happen with Homer. And the Odyssey and the Iliad. There's nothing as close to the actual time of the writing as it is with the New Testament. And this is a starring aspect of the science of studying documents. No one has what we have. The other interesting aspect to this is that, well, how many copies do we have of AD 900 of the Gallic Wars? We have 10. We have 10. 10 copies of the 7 volumes. For the New Testament, we have, in part or in whole, over 1,500. First, 2nd century. Not always the whole thing, but we have documents that go right back into within 100 years and closer. It's just amazing. It really is. And so, really, in terms of the science of looking at documents, in terms of do we have things that are closer, no one beats the New Testament. Not one writing in all the world. Nothing comes close. Most documents that we feel like we have a good hold of what the originals were tend to be anywhere from 750 to 1,000 years. Until recently, until the 1950s, now I know 1950 sounds like a long time ago, but I just want you to know I was born during that, okay? Don't try to figure it out. And so it's, but Up until that point, the oldest copy that we had of the Hebrew scriptures was the year 1000. But an interesting discovery was made during the 1950s called the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was found by a little shepherd boy who was throwing rocks at some caves. And he heard something break when he was throwing these stones. And they went discovering the caves, and there was all these huge pots full of ancient documents, including the Hebrew scriptures. And as they studied, it wasn't the whole Old Testament, but what was really interesting is that the documents, as they unfolded them and studied them, were exactly the same as the copy of the Hebrew scriptures in 1000 AD, or AD 1000. Exactly. There had been no change. By the way, it shows how important it was to those of a Jewish heritage to get the documents right. In fact, they were so exact that they counted the words and the letters on each page. So when they got to the end of this particular section that they're looking at, they made sure they were so exact, they counted things, and if it was wrong, it was tossed. Didn't matter how expensive, didn't matter how far along they were. It had to be perfect from the very beginning, and was not put out for display or used until it was finished perfectly. You know, I like to see that tried nowadays. You know, it's like, I read on my Kindle, and I go, ooh, spelling it. Oh, they can't even get the punctuation right here. It drives me crazy. Someone get this right, please. But if you want your husband to be more interested in the Bible, top with bacon, because everything's better with bacon. That's for the vegans that are very wonderful people. Okay, is the copy an accurate reproduction of the original? And actually what I was just talking about is called textual criticism. That's why the things that they found in these Dead Sea Scrolls are so amazing. Because if they're looking for errors, they didn't find any, because there aren't any. And it's just one of the amazing things that are there for us to see. Let's see. So what we often know, and I hear people talk about this still, it's like, almost like we can't depend on Bible writings. I mean, it's like, just play the telephone game, Everything gets mixed up by the time you go around the circle. Right? But that's not what, it's really a bad metaphor. It's not what's happening, this is all out in the open. And accuracy is of great importance. And so, they're not, it's not a game. And so, that's really a bad metaphor. But now, it doesn't mean that there aren't any problems, by the way. We actually have some contradictions here and there. You're saying, what? You're admitting that? But there are a couple, and I have to admit, I read them a couple, every once in a while and go, well, that's kind of interesting. No, I could get bent out of shape by that and go, oh no, I can't do the Bible. But here's it's just, I don't go there because they're actually so minuscule and they don't affect anything major. It's usually around numbers, by the way. And some of that is satisfied by the fact that different writers use numbers differently and different cultures use numbers differently. And there's a lot of rounding up. And that was just, everybody did that type of thing. And nobody said, well, you lied. It was kind of a cultural thing. And everybody did that. It's like, and so it's, they had 40 people. Oh, we had 100. But everybody counted 140. It was just the way they communicated. And so, again, you have to go back into their culture, understand why they're doing the things the way they're doing and how they're doing them before you say, oh, it's a contradiction. You're just unwise not to seek that out and try to figure it out. But the thing is that anything that we are having any discussions about that seem to clash, again, we got so many different writers and so forth, and we do know that some in the Greek New Testament we do know that there were some overzealous monks that added a few words here and there, just in their mind to make it clearer. What they did is muck it up. But anyways, we figured out most of those. But there's no other ancient document that can really boast the same degree of textual accuracy. So let me run through the rest of these really quick. Was the author a direct participant? When we look at the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Matthew and John were one of the 12. Mark, we actually think he was a part of the group that would have been with Jesus all throughout, but he would have been a young boy. That's traditionally understood. Luke becomes a partner with Paul later on in Acts, and Luke was really a historian, and is very detailed, and it's very interesting. Paul, of course, meets Jesus. We find that in the book of Acts with a vision on the way, and James will be attested to as the brother of Jesus. So will Jude, by the way. I don't know if I put it down here. Peter, obviously one of the disciples. Oh, there's Jude. Jude and James would have been born from Mary and Joseph. And so there was a lot of, in the New Testament, we have a lot of direct connection. And we can speak to all the books of the New Testament except for Hebrews. The guy was obviously into coffee, and so we're kind of Hebrews. Never mind. But anyway, we actually don't know who wrote Hebrews. Thank you. It might have been tea instead, and then. Okay, this document report events that are clearly impossible. Well, miracles, are they impossible? Are miracles impossible?
No.
Well, it kind of depends on your worldview, doesn't it?
No, it doesn't.
It's interesting. I remember one time talking to an atheist in the Commons. This guy I knew, and I asked him once. I said, "Are you absolutely sure there is no God?" And he says, "Well, I'm 99.9% sure." And I said, "Well, one, I got hope, And I said, what would it make you believe? What would need to happen for you to believe?" He said, "Well, if God showed up right now, I believe." You know what I said to him? "No, you wouldn't. You should see the shock on his face." He said, "No, you wouldn't." I said, "Because tomorrow morning, you'll wake up and figure out a reason why that happened. You'll come up with something scientific." Because I said, "You know why? Because you don't want to believe it." There really is something to that. You really have to, I always find it interesting because sometimes, it's not true across the board, but sometimes scientists are the most close-minded people in the world. Yeah, because they have their theories. If it doesn't fit the theory, it's gotta be wrong. Mind you, it's a theory. Unproven. But mind you, they're only looking for the evidence that supports them, and they disregard anything that says, "I think you guys have a problem here." And this is something that happens again. It's not just biology. It's just not, it happens in chemistry. It happens in anthropology. It happens in all sciences. Literature, same thing. Sometimes about Shakespeare to be saying something he's not saying. You don't understand anyway, so why are you bothering? Okay? I love Shakespeare, by the way. Just like throwing in there, but water into wine, walking on water, people raised from the dead. Yeah, I mean, in the natural course of events as we understand them, I've not seen water turn into wine, and I've not walked on water. Tried, didn't work. I haven't tried to raise anybody from the dead, although when I'm preaching, it seems like it. Brutal, I know, brutal. But you should have seen their faces. I mean, really, It's like, but the Bible is written from a theistic worldview, and that is, God can intervene, and God does. And that's the context. Now, you can choose not to believe that, but understand that is their context, and that is what their experience is. And so they're speaking from that. So with them, with the writers, there's no logical impossibilities in that sense. So are the events mentioned elsewhere? Yes, we Tacitus and Josephus and the Talmud. Let me put Tacitus and Josephus, there's lots of, they're referencing stuff that happens in Palestine, the land of Israel. And so there's mentions of Jesus and Christ and Pontius Pilate, a lot of things that we all know historically happened, they are reporting on. And the Talmud I put in there because that was kind of like the Jewish commentary on the Old Testament that was in use during Jesus' time. And we actually see the New Testament, we see Jesus referring to the Talmud many times because it's their commentary, it's what they're going on. And so it's really kind of fascinating that that's not someone reporting, it's just something Jesus is using. And so I always find that kind of interesting. Does the doctrine show evidence of systematic bias? Again, I asked what writing doesn't have a bias, but the question is about credibility. Is there any evidence of forging facts to suit prejudices? And again, that's examining the documents and looking at it, but you got to study it. It's just to really be able to answer that, in a credible way. Actually, to talk about credibility, but what's interesting is that most historical accounts only have the wins. This is where the Bible is vastly different, because all the heroes stink. The thing is, if I was going to write the Bible, and especially the stories, I'd have more winners. I want to, but our winners are guys like Samson who can't keep his hands off any woman he meets. He's like, but there he is, in Hebrews 11. I understand. I got Joseph, who, when he sees his brothers come, goes, oh, opportunity to get back. And oh boy, does he. And he's so mad with revenge that even when they come the second time, he's not so sure he's going to die. It's a really interesting story. You got Abraham, who travels off follows God's leading to the promised land, and then there's a famine, just keeps on going right into Egypt and says to his wife, don't tell them that you're my wife, just tell them you're my sister. Oh, that's a lot of faith, man. Yeah. God said you're going to be a man of many nations, and you're going to do it with Sarah, your wife, and if you're handing her off to the Pharaoh, I don't think that's really, real smart. That's our heroes. And the thing is that I actually think that gives it credibility because it's all real. It actually makes sense because when I look at the faithfulness of Abraham, you know what I see? Me. When I see the revengeful Joseph, who do I see? Me. Stop picking on me. And, it just is really not. It's very unfunny. But the thing is that, but that's what's meant to happen. Because if there's hope for them, there's hope for us. It's a great message. And if history repeats itself, I'm still getting a dinosaur. Okay, so real quick, any questions?